Hey everybody. In this video, I'm going to be covering Module 5 of the Final Exam Study Guide. In the previous video, we talked about the Module 4 questions, numbers 1 through 11, and in this video, we're going to be talking about questions 12 through 20. In Module 5, we were talking about conducting hypothesis tests. And so some of the questions here involve one or two steps of the hypothesis test process, or they might involve some small aspect of those questions. So for these questions here, when they're asking about a hypothesis test, on the final exam, some of the questions might be vocabulary-based questions, and some of them might be calculation-based questions. So I'm going to show you a few examples here. On number 12, it says, what are the appropriate conclusions that we can make from a hypothesis test? So in your notes packet, we talked about there's 4 steps in a hypothesis test. And when you make the conclusion, that's a step 4 of the entire hypothesis test. And in step 4, you have 2 options. Those 2 options depend on the values for P and alpha. And you had 2 situations. If P is less than alpha, or the other situation is if P is greater than alpha. So in the previous steps of the hypothesis test, you calculate the p-value, and you're given at the beginning of the problem an alpha value. And at the very end in step 4, you compare the values for p and alpha. And if p is less than alpha, then that concludes, or that leads us to the conclusion that we do what's called reject the null hypothesis. And sometimes the null hypothesis is abbreviated with the symbol H0. And the other outcome is if P is greater than alpha, we instead fail to reject the null hypothesis. And so the key difference between both of these is the words reject and fail to reject. Those are the 2 possible conclusions you could make from a hypothesis test. Number 13 asks about step 1 of the hypothesis test, which is determining the set of hypotheses. There's usually 2 of them in the problem, depending on what type of a problem it is. And there's also other clues that will tell you what type of a hypothesis test you conduct. So for example, you could be doing a left-tailed hypothesis test. You could also be doing a right-tailed hypothesis test, or you could be, whoops, I needed to highlight this one, or you could be doing a two-tailed hypothesis test. So as you can see, there's different versions here on 13, the different possible types of hypothesis tests. So parts A, B, and C are hypothesis tests for a mean. So you'll notice that each of those have the word mean in them. And the other 3 parts, D, E, and F, have the words proportion. So I'll show you what the difference is for mean and proportion. Whenever it says mean, your null hypothesis will always have an equal sign. So for H0, it'll be mu equals, and then some number. The same thing goes for all of these actually. H0, you'll have mu equals some number. H0, mu equals some number. These are all what we would call the null hypothesis. So every hypothesis test we'll have a null hypothesis. And it's this statement right here. For all of these three, it's the same, left, right, and two-tailed. The same thing applies for D, E, and F, except it's a proportion. So whenever you have a proportion, instead of saying mu equals, we'll say P equals. E equals some number. E equals some number. And so as you can see, all of these are examples of null hypothesis. They all have equal signs. And then the only difference is whether it's a mean or proportion, you've got mu or you've got P. Now the second statement in each of these 6 boxes is what we call the alternative, which is sometimes H1 or it's sometimes written as HA. And when it has a left-tailed hypothesis test, that indicates the symbol should be a less than symbol. So I'll highlight that less than right there. Similarly, if we have a right-tailed test, instead of less than, it will be a greater than symbol. So there's the right-tailed greater than symbol. And then lastly, for a two-tailed test, we've got mu does not equal. And the same rules apply now for the proportions. The only thing that's different about these is that we're using the letter P. I wrote null there. I should have wrote alternative. There we go. Okay, so H1 here is going to be P is a left-tailed, so less than. For E, H1 is going to be P is greater than, since it's a right-tailed. And then for F, it's going to be H1 is P is not equal to some number. And those are all alternative hypotheses. So notice the patterns in all of them. They all have equal signs. The ones that are left-tailed have a less than in the alternative hypothesis. Right-tailed is greater than, and then two-tailed is not equals. And then mean refers to mu. Proportion refers to the letter P. So on the final exam, you won't be asked all of these in one question. It'll just ask you one of these versions. Like it'll say, what are the hypotheses for a right-tailed test for the mean? And you'd have to pick the answer choice that has these two in them. These bottom three right here, 14, 15, and 16, these are vocabulary questions. And so for these three questions, what you would want to do is take a look at the answer key towards the back and have these definitions memorized for 14 through 16. They're pretty simple and straightforward, but take a look and read through those and just make sure that you understand them in relation to the question and study those. So for 14 through 16, take a look at the key and the descriptions given in the answers there. Let's take a look at number 17. Number 17 as well are vocabulary questions. So you should take a look at the at the answer key at the back to understand the differences between the left tail, right tail, and two-tail test. These are also things we've talked about during class. But if you do have questions about them, of course, let me know separately and I can explain them in further detail to you. I want to spend some time here focusing on 18 and 19, which are problems that involve calculating and determining all the steps that involve calculations in a hypothesis test. So let's start with number 18. Number 18 says that a company that supports small businesses claim that at least 85% of their clients are satisfied with their services. So I'm going to highlight those words right there, claim at least 85%. So that's important because that's most likely what we're going to put in our null and alternative hypothesis. Then reading further into the question says we randomly sample 100 of their former clients and ask them whether they're satisfied, and we find that 78 of them are satisfied. Do we have enough evidence at the alpha equals 0.10 level to reject the claim made by the company? So taking these pieces of information, we want to apply the 4 steps of a hypothesis test. Let's walk through the 4 steps. The first step is what we did in the previous examples, where we state the null and alternative hypothesis. So remember that the null is sometimes written as H0, and the alternative is written as H1 or HA sometimes. So in each of these statements, we're going to need to determine what will it look like out of these 6 options right here. So we need to first figure out is it left, right, or two-tailed, and then determine if it's a mean or a proportion. So looking here, we have our claim as a percentage. That tells me that this is a proportion. If it said something about a mean or an average instead, it would be using mu. But since this is a proportion, we're going to be using p. So our null hypothesis will definitely have a p equals and 85%. So that's going to be 0.85. And then alternatively, H1 will have P and it'll also have 0.85, but the symbol is going to be either less than, greater than, or less than, greater than, or not equal to. And so if you read through the question, we see that there's a less than right here in the very end, less than, and that tells us what direction or what type of test it is. This is a left-tailed test. There's a left-tailed test, that's why. There's step 1. Let's talk about step 2 now. In step 2, we want to calculate z. And the formula for z, which is in your formula chart, we're going to want to use the formula for a proportion, p hat minus p divided by the square root of pq over n. So calculating z here, p hat is going to be that 78 the 78 out of 100 who claim that they are satisfied versus the 85% that the company is claiming are satisfied, which is regular p. So across the top, we're going to have 0.78 minus 0.85. And then that's going to be divided by the square root of p times q. P is 0.85 and q is the remaining percentage out of 100 that's not the 85%. So 1 minus 0.85 essentially. So 0.85 is p and q is 0.15 because that's 15%, 85% plus 15% equals 100%. P and q should match up like that. And then n is the number of trials, or in this case, the number of companies that were asked in the sample. So 100. And so When you punch this into a calculator, the value you should end up getting is negative 1.96. That's your z value. So just to kind of pause in the middle of this question, there's still two more steps left in the entire hypothesis test, but on the final exam, um, all four of the steps wouldn't be asked in the same problem. It would give you this information and it would ask you to do one of the steps individually. So for example, it says, um, it would say, what are the null and alternative hypotheses for this situation? And you'd have to look for your answer choice that has this information in it. Or it might ask, what's the z value? You would have to do this process right here in step 2. Step 3 is to determine the probability, meaning use the row column method. And so that's referring to this number right here. This number we got in step 2 is a z-score. And when we do row column, you probably remember that we did negative 1.9 the first two digits and then 0.06 the second two digits. And we use that information to find the area under the curve. And since this is a left-tail test, we can go to our formula chart and find the area under the curve by finding the number that matches up with this row and column. So since we have a negative value, we're going to go to our negative side here, and we're going to find our row and column. So negative 1.9 and 0.06. And we're going to match those two up, and we find that our value here is 0.0250. Just like that. And just to give you a little note here, this is area to the left. And since this is a left tail test, we don't need to do anything else with this, but in the case that it's a right tail test, if this had said greater than in the question, it would be a right tail test, we would need to subtract this value. We need to do 1 minus that number to get the p-value or the area to the right. And then if it was a two-tail test, we would take this value and multiply it by 2. But since it's a left tail test, we just use this right here. So that's step 3. And then step 4 is to compare p and alpha. So p is 0.0250, and in the problem it gave us this alpha value of 0.1. And so comparing these two values, we want to determine which symbol goes in between them in terms of which one is greater and which one is less than. And it looks like we have p is less than alpha, because 0.02 versus 0.1, the left side is smaller, so we have p is less than alpha. And so the possible outcomes were these two, like we talked about in number 12. And so since we got p is less than alpha, we are going to reject the null hypothesis. And there's your conclusion. So I worked through the 4 steps of a hypothesis test here. Now for number 19, you're going to be doing something similar, and you can look at number 18 as reference to see what you should do in number 19 and practice the 4 different steps of a hypothesis test. And then double check your answers with the key to make sure that you're accurate. And later on, I'm also going to post the entire solution key to this with the other ones included that I didn't work out in the video, so you can see the step-by-step solution key there as well. So you can take a look at number 19 later. The last question here is number 20, which is also a vocab question. So be sure to reference the solution key towards the back of the packet to see the definition for this particular question. In the next video, I'm going to talk about the questions for Module 6. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out or stop by during office hours.